Yeah, wonder if I should really drive through here. Just how keen are our decision-making, goal selection skills, even as adults with fully developed, well-developed executive functions. We don't always make good decisions. Hopefully that we can learn from that and move on. So what does language do for us? And I've tried to kind of infuse this whole conversation with what does language do for us. And this is nothing that you aren't aware of. The SLP is, so well versed in what language does for us, but I think it's a really powerful slide to put it all together in one place. Primarily, it's the key thing that allows for the optimal development of executive functions. In fact, the development of executive functions is really dependent on our language. But look at these powerful verbs. Language directs, provides, assists, regulates, mediates, reflects, decides, reminds. These are all very directive, control-based verbs. That language is the tool whereby we direct our thinking, we direct our behavior, we control our emotions, we learn complex tasks or ideas, we regulate how we interact socially. Language is that means of self-talk, whether we make it verbal and auditory or whether it's silent and inner. It reminds, it regulates, it reflects, it evaluates, and helps us decide. So what about without language acquisition? How do we use self-talk? Do we use self-talk? Without inner speech, do we regulate behavior? Can we form plans? Can we articulate our thoughts? Can we describe and mediate and reflect upon and use our experiences in the future? How do we organize our conversations? The narrative language of kids, older kids, adolescents with executive function deficits is disorganized, irrelevant, fails to make its point. It's not necessarily that the content or the capacity isn't there, it's that the organizational element is missing. Without language acquisition, we lack the means of comparing and reasoning. Our thinking is not as sophisticated as it can be. Our problem-solving lags, and our social competence is often quite disrupted. I tend, again, to kind of come back to these two functional areas of problems. Communication is a tool, and it helps us to think and solve problems, and it helps us to develop social, interactive, communicative competence. And it's the tool that our frontal lobe uses to kind of mediate all of this. Without language, how do we direct? How do we organize? How efficient are we? How successful are we? And this slide I've covered throughout this whole conversation, but it is, the development of executive functions really is the longest maturational phase in humans. It does take at least 2 decades and nearly 2.5 to fully mature. And it's sort of a conglomeration of a lot of factors. Your genetic predisposition, your environmental exposure, nutrition, diet, environmental enrichment, learning capacity, whether we've got someone who's sort of poking and prodding and nurturing our development along all the way. All of those things come together to get what's that optimal piece of development for us. And there is a lot of information on the normal developmental time span for executive functions. There is not enough time in this conversation to talk about that, but you can access that information. It's not all nice and tidy yet. It's not like we've got stacks and stacks of research that will give us nice tidy little charts about phonemic acquisition and syntactic acquisition. It's not that cut and dry, mostly because a lot of the researchers tend to use slightly different terms and study slightly different groups of children at different ages, and different skill levels and different capacities, and so you have to kind of pull everything together. That piece of research is still really in its infancy, and so there's so much more that is being done and needs to be done to help us understand. But there are some clear trends that are present. Okay, I've talked about problem solving and social competence, and I want to briefly kind of go through those next two slides and just reiterate the idea of what language does to facilitate good problem solving. It helps make our planning and organization relevant. It keeps our attention focused on relevant input. Good problem solving is dependent on how well we inhibit impulses and manage distractions. It's dependent on our self-regulation. Do we monitor, identify, recognize, correct errors in our efforts? Do we self-direct stopping something that's failing and initiating a new plan that might succeed? Are we adaptive and flexible? That reads just like a cut and dry list of executive function skills. What about the elements of social competence? Well, again, impulse control and working memory. I have to have accurate nonverbal reads on people and circumstances and situations and faces. I've got to be able to adapt my behaviors and mediate my language to fit different criteria. I have to have empathy and be able to take the perspective of other people. And I need impulse control and working memory to keep in mind what's been said, what's been done, what's going on, what do I realize about the past. A lot of this social competence is more dependent on nonverbal processing and right hemisphere skills, and that's a whole other conversation about how is the right hemisphere developing. In some disorders like Asperger's and nonverbal learning disorder, those kids don't have good right hemisphere skills. They don't do these nonverbal reads well. They can't interpret the nonverbal circumstances or emotions or perspectives. Theory of mind is not well developed in a lot of those groups of kids. And so the prefrontal cortex is kind of dependent on, information processing, the quality of how well you process verbal information and nonverbal information. I'm dependent on both the right and the left hemispheres. And I won't have good social competence because if I'm regulating things poorly, and I don't have good impulse control, good decision making, good organization, and good planning, that's an executive function problem. But if I don't have good right hemisphere skills feeding me in quality information, I'm kind of at a disadvantage to begin with. So within those two frameworks, trickle down a host of different kinds of functional problems in a lot of kids with different disorders. For me, I think it helps to put some meaning into lists of executive function skills that are known to be deficit in certain diagnostic labels. How do you relate it overall to problem-solving potential and social competence potential? This is not a complete list of research that has looked at executive functions in children with these diagnoses. Really, it kind of seems like you could Google anything even, and if it exists, there's somebody out there who has begun or is doing research on the executive function skills for that population. And as I said, there's a tremendous amount of research that talks about the executive function deficits in a population of people who have developed normally and gone through their full maturational developmental span. They're adults, they have an acquired injury, and now look. But it isn't just traumatic brain injury. There are metabolic disorders, there are neurological progressive diseases, there are a whole host of things that can have an impact on executive functions. And within the group of developmental disorders and childhood labels that you might see, this is just a sampling. Fetal alcohol syndrome, I don't know if yes, I do have that on here. Fragile X, I have that on here. Williams syndrome, TBI, ADHD, Asperger's autism, Williams syndrome. Got some of these on here twice, I see. That's okay. So what's a brief kind of overview of the deficits that we see? Of course, executive function deficits in this study were found to be strongly associated with the deficits in communication, play, and reciprocal social relationships in children who had autism. Other studies are finding global overall general deficits in the population of kids who have autism and how their executive functions develop. It's not yet the case that there's a real specific pattern that has emerged that you can clearly say, okay, this is how the child with autism presents with regard to executive function. But think about the inflexible behavior of a child who presents with autism. The inability to engage in purposeful, goal-directed behaviors in some kids with autism is quite a deficit. Planning and organization tend to be poor in kids with autism. What about self-initiation and persisting with tasks in order to come to some conclusion? Flexibility is a huge issue in the population of autistic kids. How to adapt, how to shift attention, how to process content simultaneously, how to shift so that you avoid being perseverative and non-purposeful in behavior, and how to regulate one's affect and demonstrate deficit awareness or self-awareness.